G'day, it's Jimmy Bartell.
And Bruce Eva. Our podcast, Yesterday's Heroes, covers all sports.
Honestly, what are you bringing to the table, Beaver?
The knowledge.
Let's test it. How many test wickets did Uak McGrath take?
563.
How many laps around Mount Panorama?
I told you this the other week, 161.
As usual, I wasn't listening to you. Who's winning the Ashes?
Well, that's up to us to debate.
No debate. We'll absolutely romp it in, so listen to me for your tips.
And to me to sound sports smart.
Well, listen to both of us. Subscribe to Yesterday's Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
New episodes every Thursday, thanks to PointsBet.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Salinger-Morris. It's Wednesday, May 31st. A week ago, Clare Nowland, a 95-year-old great-grandmother, died after being tasered. She weighed 43 kilograms and suffered from dementia. The case has shone a spotlight on New South Wales Police, which is now battling to regain control. Today, state political reporter Michael McGowan on who should police the police and why calls for greater oversight have a history of being ignored. So, Michael, can you tell me about Clare Nowland? What should we know about her?
Yeah, so Clare Nowland was a 95-year-old woman who lived in Cooma, which is a town in southern New South Wales. And she's one of these ladies who was a really sort of big part of the fabric of this small town, right? She had volunteered at the local St Vincent de Paul for years. She celebrated her 80th birthday by going skydiving, which was captured by local news crews at the time. She was a staple of the local Catholic parish, very active in charities and things like that. Just one of these people who kind of, hold a town like that together. And then in more recent years, she became a resident of Yallambee Lodge, an aged care home in Cooma, and she was suffering from dementia, which we've heard from members of the community is sort of wax and waned. She was, I suppose, a 95-year-old lady with dementia.
And so can you tell me about what happened to her on May 17th? Because obviously there's been so many headlines, and just from observing it from a distance, it seems shocking. I mean, it seems crazy what happened. So can you just sort of walk us through that?
So what we know is that in the early hours of Wednesday morning, aged care staff call an ambulance to Yallambee Lodge because she's holding what we've been told is a steak knife that she wouldn't drop.
That staff had seen Mrs. Nowland carrying around a serrated steak knife. So those two responding...
Subsequently, the ambulance officers then call police. Senior Constable Christian White is at home in bed. He's already done a shift. He gets the call to come in with his female partner.
So those two responding officers had reportedly seen Mrs. Nowland approaching them very slowly with that serrated steak knife as she was holding her walking frame.
Obviously, we don't know the full details of what subsequently happens, but what we're told is that Nowland refuses to drop the knife, starts to move slowly using a walking frame to Christian White's female partner, at which point allegedly he pulls out his taser and tasers Clare Nowland.
The elderly woman who was tasered by a New South Wales police officer in the state's Snowy Mountains region has died in hospital. The announcement came just hours after the officer who tasered her at her nursing home in Cooma was charged. Let's go to reporter...
And do we know anything else? I mean, I know we don't know the full picture of what happened in that aged care room, but Clare Nowland, as I understand it, weighs 43 kilos, which is the size of an average 13-year-old boy. By all accounts, she was moving very slowly. Like you said, she moves with a walker. And I think there was a report that the constable allegedly said, bugger that, and then tasered her, allegedly. So do we know any other details about how this happened?
No. And that will be, I suppose, the focus of the criminal case that will now be ongoing. So Christian White was charged last week with recklessly causing grievous bodily harm, assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and common assault. Now, those charges obviously could change because they were laid before her death. I think one of the things that came through in our reporting during the week is this sense that it sounds glib and obvious, but I don't think anyone in that room expected what happened to happen, right? Like, this is an elderly woman who has dementia, what's occurred is a significant escalation, I suppose, on what you might expect to occur in that kind of setting.
And it seems clear from your reporting that this isn't just Nowland that this has happened to, but there's others. This is happening sort of all over New South Wales. Can you take us through some of the other instances when this has happened?
Yeah, so a few years ago, there's a case with a guy named Jack Okoa, who's someone who has significant sort of I suppose, history with police, but also significant history with mental health issues. And this is a case where he was stopped by police earlier in the day, taken to Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney and held as an involuntary mental health patient. He then absconded from the hospital. Some of the same police then located him. He allegedly became aggressive, and police used a taser on him multiple times. He suffered from a heart condition and subsequently died, right? There's a whole bunch of things to talk about in that case, but I suppose, one of the key things is this is an incident where police knew that Jack Okoa had mental health issues. Some of them had dealt with him earlier in the day, but he was also allegedly acting aggressively, right? So you have, in some senses, police in a difficult position because they're being called to these events to deal with someone with mental health. And the taser is supposed to be the sort of non-lethal alternative to a firearm, right? That's why we saw tasers introduced in New South Wales a bit over a decade ago.
And it's not just tasering, though, that's the problem, it seems, in New South Wales Police Force right now. It's also excessive force. You've reported on the case of, I think it was a 13-year-old Aboriginal boy who I think suffered head trauma. Is that right? Not that long ago.
Yeah, this is a case from 2020 where an officer performed what's called a leg sweep on this teenage boy after he said something to the police officer, and then we've subsequently seen that officer convicted of assault only last week. So these cases come up somewhat regularly, right?
Yeah.
And that's when we get into the territory of what we call the critical incident investigation, which is when police conduct an investigation into the police.
Yeah, Michael, that's what I'd really like to focus the conversation on now. Can you explain this to me? Help me understand, what do you mean by police investigating police?
I think there's a few things to unpack, right? So let's use the Nowland case as the example. What happens is, when something like this happens, the police declare a critical incident investigation. So that's an investigation that's launched when someone dies or is seriously injured during a police operation. Those investigations are handled by the New South Wales Police. There is another body called the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission whose job is to oversee those investigations. So they're the police watchdog, right? Like they're the oversight body. Again, there's a few things to unpack there, but I suppose going to your question, one of the issues I think that happens with the critical incident investigations is we find out very little about what happens as a result of them, and they can take a very, very long time to finalise. Like I reported last week that there are still critical incident investigations going back to 2017 that haven't been finalised, right? And then at the end of them, I mean, the New South Wales Police are not an organisation, I guess, famously known for its transparency. And so I think it's an issue where we don't learn too much about what happens as a result of those probes.
Right.
And so you've had calls in the last couple of weeks, the Nowland case, for that critical incident investigation to be released.
Right. Okay, so I want to get into that, but I'm hoping you can take us back a bit. Has it always been the case that police are investigating themselves when something goes wrong, when there's a critical incident?
So I can go back to 2015. There are three agencies at the time who are sort of vaguely in charge of sort of police oversight. There's the Ombudsman, the Police Integrity Commission, and the policing side of the Crime Commission. There's a review in 2015 led by a well-respected public servant, which essentially calls for the merging of those three agencies to create the LEC. But what it recommends is that those investigations stay in police hands. And the basic reasoning is that this is what police are good at. They are good at investigating things, and that it would cost quite a lot of money to set up a whole new agency that had those powers. But there have long been criticisms of this role because there's a pretty obvious and inherent conflict of interest involved, right? Like the idea that police can sort of unemotionally stand back and investigate their colleagues is, I think, for some people, too far of a logic bridge to cross. I think a lot of people find that very difficult to believe. I should say, like in the Nowland case, there's no suggestion that this investigation isn't being done correctly. Like that's not the criticism. I think it's, can we really maintain this status quo where every time an incident like this happens, people rightfully have questions about like what's happening behind the scenes here.
Right. Okay. And so can you take us through this overseeing body that actually investigates the police when things go wrong? Like, how does it work? Because, it does seem hard to understand why police are investigating police. It seems like, no one's going to be held accountable when people within an organization are investigating their own people. So can you just sort of tell us how it works?
So basically, critical incident investigation is declared. Police from a different area command are sort of tasked with running that investigation, and that's supposed to be a measure to sort of deal with conflicts of interest. Although we know from various other reports that often those conflicts of interest haven't been managed well in the past. But the LEC in this situation, its job is, it doesn't supervise, it doesn't take part in the interviews, although it would like to. It merely sort of oversees what's happening.
Right.
So one of the issues is it can't intervene in any way. It can't direct police to do anything. If it has concerns, it can raise them internally with police. But what we've found in our reporting is that in the 6 years since the LEC was set up, it's only ever publicly criticised the police once over a critical incident investigation.
Okay. And so, I mean, this kind of cycle that we're seeing, police investigating themselves, nothing seems to come of it, or if it does, we don't hear much about it, so we don't know of anything coming of it. So that sort of maybe erodes community confidence that there's any consequences. Do you think it gives police a sense of invincibility, which is perhaps why we're seeing this happen over and over again? And if that is the case, how do we break the cycle?
You're right. If nothing else, it certainly within the sort of broader community raises questions about the way police operate and I think erodes that sense of the public has a compact with the police, right? We create an agency that is armed and can use lethal force if it needs to protect us, but that's a compact and that goes both ways. And part of that is that they aren't, I suppose, above the law. And I think the lack of transparency around these processes and maybe the lack of sort of stress testing in those processes means that often for a lot of people in the public, and often the most marginalised people in society, Indigenous people, poor people, people who suffer from mental health issues, lack trust in the police.
Right, okay. And so what do you think it'll take to break this cycle? I mean, why don't governments crack down on this? Why do we not have a different system? Why is it still police investigating police?
I mean, I think there are sort of two parts to this, right? There's like a practical part and there's a political part. Practical part is it's hard and expensive to set up an agency that, really, really thoroughly polices the police, right? It's just costs a lot of money and it's difficult to do. There isn't a model that exists within Australia that you could easily sort of transfer into New South Wales. I suspect that the more compelling reason is that it is very difficult politically in New South Wales to criticise the police. Police reform is sort of like the third rail of New South Wales politics because police put their own lives in danger protecting, on a very like sort of surface level, it looks bad for a politician to criticise the police. It's just politically very difficult for, I think, any MPs in New South Wales to really come out and start criticising the police. They also have a strong union. It's a sort of tough needle thread. And I think as well, particularly this current government in New South Wales and also the previous government, there isn't a lot to gain from doing this.
So it's like political suicide, in other words, to sort of take this on.
Yeah, I think that's fair, yes.
And so this Clare Nowland case, I think we can all agree, has been so devastating. It's certainly captured the nation's attention. I mean, do you think this could be a tipping point? Like, are we going to see change on a structural level now within the New South Wales Police? And if not now, then what would it take?
I don't think we'll see significant structural change, no. I've been writing about this subject for a long time, and as I said, it is very difficult to sort of see the sort of political will there. This current government, certainly policing reform is not a priority for it, right? Like, it's not something it wants to buy into. This is not an issue it is sort of trying to lead from the front on. I would not expect to see any broad reform. Yeah, you may see some sort of tinkering with the Lex power and its sort of agency here, and perhaps the use of tasers, but I wouldn't hold my breath.
Thank you, Michael, so much for joining us.
No worries, thanks for having me.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Margaret Gordon, with technical assistance from Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.
Hi, Phil Gould here. Love your rugby league? Then you'll want to hear my take on every round of NRL season in my podcast, 6 Tackles with Gus. Get it every Wednesday afternoon, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to Bluebet, just search 6 Tackles with Gus.